Hi there, I'm Mark Isero, and welcome back to Article Club, where we read and discuss the best articles on race, education, and culture. It's July, everyone, and I hope that you're enjoying your summer. I hope you're resting and relaxing, and I hope you're getting some good reading done. I'm excited to discuss this month's selection with you all. As many of you know, we are going to be listening to the podcast Southlake by NBC reporters Mike Hixenbaugh and Antonia Hilton. Southlake is a six-part podcast about how a mostly white community in a Texas suburb failed to respond to the harm that white students caused when they chanted the N-word in a video after a homecoming dance in 2018. The entire podcast is extremely well done, but for our discussion coming up next Saturday, July 20th, we're going to be focusing on episodes 2 and 3, which really get at the heart of the racism in Southlake schools, as well as the backlash that happens once the community tries to do something about it. So if this interests you, I warmly invite you to our discussion next Saturday. You can get more info and sign up at highlighter.cc/discussion. All right, let's get to this month's interview, which I'm very excited about. It's with Mike Hixenbaugh, one of the creators of Southlake. Our conversation was about the podcast, of course, but it really centered on his new book, which emerged from Southlake and which was published in May. The title of the book is They Came for the Schools: One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New War for America's Classrooms. Now, of course, I've read the book, and when I tell you that it's a great book, I am not aggrandizing. It's extremely well written, first of all, and it's like the podcast, except there's just more there. I would say it's actually even better than the podcast, if that's possible. There's just more context in it. It offers a fuller picture. It really tells the story in a meaningful way. So in this interview, Mike and I get to talk about his book, how he got interested in the story in the first place, how he approached his reporting as a white man, how he tried to take in the viewpoints of conservative people in Southlake, but also how he let the facts speak for themselves. And most importantly, perhaps, how he listened to students. It was one of my favorite conversations that we've had here at Article Club, and I hope you enjoy it too. Here it is. Mike Hixenbaugh, thank you so much for doing Article Club.
Thanks for having me on.
It's so great to read your book, also to listen to Southlake. About the book, how are you feeling about it? It seems to be doing very, very well.
Yeah, I wrote this book because I wanted for any parent or teacher anywhere in the country who has seen angry parents showing up at school board meetings or trying to ban critical race theory or remove library books. My hope was that they would be able to read this and have a better understanding of why that's happening by connecting the current moment to history and by also telling the story really deeply in one very representative community. And I feel like the response I've gotten from people has confirmed that that's the message people are taking away from it. I'm hearing from people all over the country who are saying, oh, this makes me feel either less alone if you're a teacher who's been targeted, or it has made people feel like they better understand what's happening in their suburb outside of Philadelphia or Atlanta. By reading the story of Southlake, Texas, they kind of get a sense of why it's happening, who's behind it, and how it connects to a much longer history. And so for all those reasons, I'm thrilled that people are finding the book and it's resonating with them.
Yeah, it definitely has resonated with me as well as other folks at Article Club. And one of the reasons is that a lot of us are educators and we're sort of in it, but we don't really know what's going on exactly from sort of like a larger point of view. And I really felt, especially the book and also the podcast, but especially the book, it was like you were offering us some space and distance in a very organized way about how this all went down. And wanted to ask you from the beginning, like, how were you able, because you're the reporter in it on a daily basis, how were you able to get some distance and perspective to be able to sort of organize the worldview of it?
Yeah, well, so my background is in newspaper writing, and I've always been interested in narrative investigative journalism. And so from the beginning, I've been thinking about this story in terms of the narrative arc of this community in Southlake. So that's really what I used to organize it. Southlake, the community, almost becomes the main character of the book because there is no central person whose story I trace from beginning to end. Southlake, Texas is the community that is the stand-in for that main character. And so that gave me a framework for how to tell this huge story. I mean, really, the interest from publishers on this was to be able to tell a story about what's happening with the school board culture wars in America. And that's such huge, that has spread everywhere. There's a new story every day. It's like a fire hose of information. And so my goal with this was to, let's just zero in on this place and these people. And by doing that, I can actually take the story and tell it over a much longer timeline. And so in the book, even more so than the podcast, we go back in time. Like, we open in 1956 instead of 2006 or 2016. And we kind of tell the story of the evolution of America's suburbs through this one suburb. And within that, I found, different people, like certain parents of Black students, a teacher like Christina McGurk, a school board member like Michelle Moore, whose stories then become kind of stand-ins for school board members who are targeted across the country, or teachers across the country who are having parents complain about their classroom libraries. So within that kind of framework of the town is the story, and its chronology is how we tell the story. I was able to place those characters, those people, within the narrative.
I thought that was really brilliant as well. Like in your preface, you talk about the suburbs first, and then obviously you center on Southlake. You could have framed this book in so many different ways, about race or about schools, and it's about all these things. But as you say, the main character is around not just Southlake, but also this concept of suburbs in general. And I know that, you also speak to how you also moved to a suburb, and I guess I wanted to ask sort of like, why did that sort of continue to resonate for you as an overall framing mechanism?
Yeah, well, so the suburbs for so long in our country have been this magnet for opportunity. That's the way people have seen them. Whether or not that's a true depiction or not, that's how people in this country see it. It's a chance to get your kid a great education in a school that's maybe better than the one that you went to, and maybe the houses are affordable there. But for so long, that promise has been walled off for many Americans. And as we've seen those walls come down and the suburbs become more diverse, suburbs really became the true test of this idea of America as a melting pot. Like, what's happening in the suburbs is this is where you're really getting Trump voters living next door to LGBTQ rights activists, because everyone is drawn to the same thing in these communities, especially in places like Southlake or the community outside of Houston where I was living. And so I was reacting to what I was seeing and experiencing, and what my family was seeing, experiencing, because I didn't have to place myself in other people's shoes so much as just I already kind of was in them as someone living in one of these communities and raising kids there, multiracial kids in a multiracial family. And so, part of what really drove me to pursue this as a deep project was my wife, who is a biracial Black woman, had such a visceral and, so to me, initially surprising reaction to the ugly culture war divisions that were showing up in our neighborhood, on our community Facebook page, and in people's front lawns with the political signs. It wasn't just like, oh, this is annoying, or rolling her eyes. She was physically ill almost, and felt like this really strong feeling of, I'm not welcome here. And so having that, deep relationship with her helped me to think, oh, she's probably not the only one feeling this. If she's feeling it this intensely, I can imagine that this is a major fracture point for people in communities like this all over the country. And that's what got me started on it and what kept me going.
Yeah, when you did get started on it, yeah, that's a really great point too. Like also your identity and also your family and your wife, and then also Antonia Hilton as well, your
Yes.
partner on this. Do you remember sort of how you felt at the beginning of reporting this as you got into Southlake, as a white man, also sort of like trying to figure it out? Do you remember your own sort of first impressions of the place and how you sort of, because as a reporter, you do this all the time, but how did your identity sort of interact and engage right from the beginning?
Yeah, I immediately connected with white students in Southlake because I grew up in an all-white rural community in Ohio. And I had this experience of going off to college and suddenly being around people, much more diverse students. And I felt like, as a result of the world I grew up in and the complete failure by my local school district back in the 1990s to try to teach me about other cultures or people outside of Garrettsville, Ohio, I said things in college that I look back on, I'm just like cringing and so regretful. I wasn't saying racial slurs, but I was just, what we would characterize as microaggressions, dumb comments that would other classmates, including my future wife. And so when I came to the story, I saw myself in those kids. I never chanted the N-word, but I can imagine the level of the world that they grew up in that led them to that moment. And so for me, it was like, oh, well, I wish when I was a kid that there would have been some lessons or some structure within the school to really teach me the full accounting of racism in America, to help me understand how subtle things can really be damaging to a student of color. I wish I had those things. And so my perspective was I understood why the community was attempting to address those issues. And I also had heard from former white students in Southlake who had the same experience as me. They left Southlake, went to college, and then realized, oh, the thing I just said was kind of racist, or the way I touched my black girl's hair and commented on it, that was hurtful to her. I wish I had known that sooner. And so that was my perspective coming to the story. I wanted to understand why people were so angry on the other side in response to attempts to try to address these things and educate their kids. And so that was the initial article I did, was really trying to bridge the gap between how it appeared to me that the story was playing out and how those parents who would later, organize to stop critical race theory, how they were viewing it and why they were so angry.
But what was interesting is you came to the story after all this sort of like went down, like in later 2020. So
That's right.
that really like big board meeting where everything went horrible had already happened. But then in the book, as well as in the podcast, you go back in time a little bit to report on the racist video. So like you go
Yeah.
back in time to like report on that. And just really like as just like a person who's not a journalist, but like as a reader, like how did you reconstruct sort of like a time that was no longer? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because it was 2020. And so, like, especially with what happened at the dance, but also what happened in that principal's office, how did you go about reconstructing that in, and not just an accurate way, but a way that really got at some of those emotions?
Yeah. Well, so first, the reason I really wanted to do that is because when you just pulled up a school board meeting in 2020 or 2021 and compared what parents were saying then to what Black parents and students, the parents of Black students, were saying back in 2018 when they were coming forward and saying, this is what my students experience in the school, it felt like two different realities. And so I wanted to make sure people fully understood why this community and this school board had decided to make this plan. And so to reconstruct those years that had already passed by before I started reporting on it, I was really fortunate in that a lot of the stuff was recorded. Part of the reason we were drawn to this story in the first place is journalists, especially when we were making the podcast, you need kind of immersive sound because these fights were playing out a lot in public meetings that are recorded and posted on the internet. We had all these hours of school board audio that helped us to reconstruct the story. And then, Raven Rolled, the Black student who confronted a white classmate who was using the N-word, she had secretly recorded on her phone her conversation, her just really emotional conversation with the bumbling high school principal and the student from, I think, 2019. And so because of that, you're able to immerse both in the podcast, the listener, and in the book, the reader, in these kind of scenes that you feel like you're a fly on the wall. Like it reads like I was in the room, but I wasn't. The audio, along with some kind of deep interviews with the people who were there, allowed us to paint a full picture of what happened. And again, by doing that, I think for a lot of people who came to the story and realized in 2021, wow, parents are really mad about this thing, critical race theory at school board. What is this about? What was left out of most of the immediate coverage of that was what was happening in those school districts is these are diversifying suburbs where racist stuff happened during the Trump years. And communities were outraged and embarrassed. And so they set out to try to address that by putting together these diversity committees, diversity plans, and hiring consultants to do anti-racism work. It didn't just spring up out of nowhere. I don't see evidence that there was some vast left-wing plot to take over America's schools with Marxism. It was a response by a lot of actually moderate conservative folks to try to address racism that they hadn't been aware of until the Trump presidency really brought it to light in 2016, 17, 18, and 19.
Yeah, it was really beautifully reported and written in the book, and it was a great memory of what I feel like you're saying that 2019 was actually a potential for hope. They were working on this plan. They had a district diversity council. They were working on stuff about implicit bias, white fragility, microaggressions. This is when Kendi comes out with his book. It's almost like 2019, there was some possibility there. And what was really great is how you sort of reported that, but also were really compassionate about the community and what they were trying to do. But then I could not forget that one scene with the principal and Raven, because at the same time that the district was working on something in 2019, it also so happened that on the ground, and because we're educators, we all make mistakes and everything, but you do not seem to have very much compassion for this principal and how bumbling he is, because it's not just in this incident, but it's also later in the book with Mia. So like, it just seems like you just allowed the facts to just be as they were.
Yeah, that's right. I definitely attempted to just let the conversation speak for itself. But it's true that when I wrote the scene with Raven and Principal Duhan, I already was aware of the scene 2 years later with Mia Mariani, which was, if you listen to the thing with his conversation with Raven and you read that, you could come away with the idea that this guy means well. And I'm not saying he doesn't mean well, but you could come away from that saying he didn't necessarily do the best he could to try to address this by saying she's too pretty to get upset about a racial slur. But when you get to the Mia encounter, it's much more explicit that he's minimizing her pain, seems not to grasp or care about the slurs and just the way that she was mocked by her classmates for her gender identity. But yeah, it felt like that showed that even though the district was making these strides, that behind the scenes, this was still the reality inside the schools during those years. And it points to very subtly a critique from Black parents and parents of LGBTQ kids and just minorities in general about DEI programs that often they feel that they're lip service or for show. I think the people behind the diversity plan in Southlake hoped that it would be more than that, but there is a widespread criticism, even from the left, that, well, DEI is corporate. It's like PR. It's to make it look like we're doing something. And then folks like Principal Duhan keep doing what they're doing on a daily basis. They just had to check the box that they went to a training.
It's just really bad. And yeah, Texas law where you can record people without them knowing, like that
It
was
is a beautiful thing.
That was a huge thing for you. I know you get this question a lot, but like, how do you decide as a reporter? For example, when do you know when to sort of let something just speak for itself? And when do you go more for the truth versus compassion, especially in 2020, as you try to get to know some of the white conservative families? There's just a lot of compassion there. Like you're not out to get them. And yet sometimes you actually do have to tell the truth of the racism almost to their faces. It's not your job as a reporter, but I guess just technically as a writer and reporter, is that just by feel? Like, how do you decide sort of like what to do when?
Yeah, my thought often is let the cake speak for itself, let this moment speak for itself. And if you put all the context into the story, people will see the full picture. And there's just a handful of moments, especially when I'm writing about just kind of regular folks, parents showing up at school board meetings, where I felt I have no choice but to, quote them saying that racism doesn't exist, or that, I think there's a line at one school board meeting in 2020 where a parent's talking about how there's no difference in what you can achieve based on your race in the country. And it felt like, well, I just need to, that's her perspective, but also here's statistics on how, like, we live in a country where Black family wealth is a tiny fraction of white families. And, this is decades and decades after the Civil Rights Act. And so I just felt like that adding that context is important, not to, criticize those parents for their views, but just to put them in context that they may not be supported by data, or, the alternative, if the parent wants to wrestle with that, is in a country where those disparities exist. There's two choices. There's either racism in our system, or you believe that certain races are superior. And when you just kind of lay it out that way, it's difficult for those parents to continue to articulate their view without getting really defensive.
But it does seem that you spent a lot of time trying to get to understand them. And I try to do that too. Like, even though, I live in Oakland, I'm left of center or whatever, it's very easy just to get into our tribes and to sort of like not listen. And what I loved about the book is that there's plenty of time as a reader to fully listen to what was going on, especially in 2020, 2021. Once they start doing the pack and like the whole thing with sort of like the dominionism, I was like, wow, like that's a whole nother chapter. But like right in the middle, when the pandemic was happening, as well as post George Floyd, it just seemed like they were getting mad, but they didn't really know why they were mad. And you spent a lot of time listening to them. And it was just really brilliant how you were able to sort of like just listen, but also maybe possibly know that they weren't necessarily making sense on a cognitive level. It was very visceral, like this idea of, I don't want to be a victim, and yet I'm acting like a victim.
Yeah,
Or the
yeah.
police are good, but we don't want the diversity police, sort of like these combinations, the juxtapositions. And then you introduce the great replacement theory, which most people think is this totally far right thing, but you sort of bring it a little bit more close to home. Can you say a little bit more about that, about how the suburbs are changing? Like, what do you feel was going on, not just in those school board meetings, but in the community, right? Sort of like when you were doing it at the late 2020 into 2021.
What really, and it's in the book, the moment that brought that home for me, that connection, was when I was interviewing a Black parent named Angela Jones. Very early in my reporting on this, before I'd even written the first article for NBC News, in on January 6th, 2021, I was on the phone with her and had MSNBC on my computer monitor because it was, January 6th. I was watching the protests in DC. And Angela was telling me this very painful story of her family moving to Southlake, trying to get her kids the best education they can, understanding that most of the other kids didn't look like hers, but they wanted the best for their kids. And it seemed like everyone was welcoming. And the backlash to the diversity plan had opened her eyes to this idea, this belief that was forming in her, that certain parents were upset, not just that the school was going to be teaching about racism in our history or doing diversity trainings, but that some folks were actually upset that fewer and fewer white kids were graduating at the top of the class at Carroll, which had been the case for decades. But now, in the last several years, South Asian kids had been taking those positions year after year. And Angela was describing this to me as I was watching on the screen, as people, mostly white Christians, were attacking the Capitol to try to keep Trump in power, based in part on beliefs that they had that they were losing their status in America. Immigrants and LGBTQ people were replacing them in positions of power in society, and that they had to fight, take control. And so Angela was describing a hyper-local version of the Great Replacement, that all of these people were moving into Southlake and taking our positions, and now look, they're trying to take over the curriculum. And it really felt like those stories are actually intertwined, they're part of the same story.
And you also talk about how many Black families are saying, like, well, this is just the price of admission. This is the cost. Like, being in
Yeah.
Southlake, you just have to deal with it. And that was just like really very true, obviously, but also very difficult to read over and over again. And it did get me at the end of the book, like wondering if, like, what now? I'm not asking for hope or whatever, but, like, you also seem to predict a lot of the things that are going on right now with regard to the Ten Commandments, with regard to the Bible. Like, you're right there in Texas, so you sort of like know where this is all leading. And then you have at the end of the book just this, I thought, really sad but true anecdote at the graduation, where it's a graduation, everybody's graduating, it's supposed to be like a really happy thing. And yet the white folks in the audience are basically saying like, oh, well, there's fewer white people being valedictorians. And also I cannot, like, one person actually said that they cannot understand the speech by one of the students. And that was really, for some reason, that really hit me hard. And so I wanted to ask you, not like, how do you keep hopeful? Because you might not be hopeful, but I guess, what do we do and what do you do as far as next steps coming into not just this election, but like going into the next 4 years?
Yeah, the thing I've just been saying in terms of maintaining hope for myself, in terms of what is my mission in journalism, is that telling stories in deep ways helps people make more informed choices. I think each person has to find their own kind of outlet as we're entering this period in our history. And so that's been it on a personal level. People have asked me that question, what gives you hope? I think there's a desperation among interviewers and just people generally to like, give me something here. These bitter fights are really devastating for communities, no matter which side you're on. And so what gives me hope is the kids. And we mentioned Mia Mariani, this who in the book you meet is like a queer 16-year-old student who's fielding these vicious attacks based on her gender and getting no support from her principal. Actually, the principal's conduct in response to her hurt is more painful and damaging to her than the boys. And when I met her, she was kind of a very quiet 16 or 17-year-old who was still finding her voice, but wanted to tell her story. Very recently, I spoke to her again because the storyline throughout the book that's left unresolved at the end of the book is the federal government, the education department that Donald Trump wants to abolish, is responsible for enforcing federal civil rights laws, including you get equal access to education without discrimination, regardless of your race, sexuality, sex, or gender. The federal education department had opened civil rights investigations in Southlake because of these issues that were unresolved. And a few months ago, notified the district that they had indeed found civil rights violations. One of those cases was Mia Mariani's.
Wow.
And so Mia, who felt like she had no voice, that the district wouldn't listen to her, she and her parents took her issues to the federal government, and the federal government came in and said, yes, you were discriminated against, your civil rights were violated. And right now the district is supposed to be working out the resolution of that. But when I spoke to Mia about that, she's now a young college student. And first of all, she sounded so much more confident in her voice that she's found her voice. And the thing she told me was, whatever changes come out of this investigation, it's too late. That for me, that's my high school experience, and the pain I got from that is part of me. But if this leads to positive changes for kids that follow me, then that is healing for me. And I was just like, it gave me chills. It was such a beautiful sentiment. And so the hope that I see is in the resiliency of young people. And I remember when I was 17, 19, 21, 22, I don't remember articulating myself quite so clearly or having a purpose like that. And so I think it's really compelling and inspiring.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, let's listen to the kids, and to the young people because they're resilient and they'll be able to share with us sort of like where we need to go. So thank you so much for this, Mike. Thanks so much for sharing your views. Thanks so much for your book. I can't wait to try to share it with more people. But yeah, thank you so much for doing Article Club.
Thank you for reading and sharing.
I'd like to thank Mike Hixenbaugh yet again for generously saying yes to doing this interview for Article Club. And listeners, I'd like to thank you too for listening, and I hope you like this conversation. If you did like it, I invite you to come to our discussion next Saturday, July 20th, starting at 2 p.m. We're going to be over at Zoom, and you can sign up at highlighter.cc/discussion. If that kind of thing is not your thing, please feel free to do all the other things. You can share Article Club with your friends, rate this podcast 5 stars on Apple, subscribe to the newsletter, or even get a paid subscription if you like. You can do all of this at articleclub.substack.com. All right, thank you again, and I hope you have a great weekend.